Welcome back. I'm John Luckner from the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado in the United States. And so thanks for joining me again. In this session, we're going to talk about behaviors of skilled readers and what are the things that you can do to help them develop those skills. What I want to start off is helping us remember how complex reading is. Because we're skilled readers, we forget the complexity of it, but it requires language skills, it requires decoding skills, it requires comprehension skills, and it requires that we do all these things in a very automatic process. And there's a very beautiful diagram here that captures that I want you to look at. I'd like to start with highlighting some of the behaviors that the literature tells us about students who are deaf and hard of hearing, and some of the behaviors that they haven't acquired, and as a result, it hinders their ability to become very skilled readers. The first is problems with word recognition. They really have a hard time decoding words. They haven't become fluent, as I've spoken in a previous video. Their vocabulary is limited because of the challenges they have of learning incidentally. So much of our vocabulary is acquired in interactions with others. The other way that we acquire vocabulary is by reading. But if you're not a skilled reader, you read less. We have that challenge of understanding figurative language, where the words that are there are not exactly what they mean. He's as busy as a bee, or she's a fox, or I'm as hungry as a horse. None of those mean exactly what they mean word for word, and frequently we have to teach those, or you have to be exposed to those incidentally. I talked about this earlier also on this weak topic knowledge, or this lack of background knowledge, which is so essential for building knowledge. The best predictor of future knowledge is what we've known before. We have that slow rate of reading, and it's because we haven't reached fluency. It's the challenges of syntax that we see in text, where sometimes the noun appears in the beginning and other times it's embedded after several phrases. We have the challenges of different genres, such as narrative and expository and electronic, and each one of those require different strategies and how do we make sense of those genres. As I said on the video on itinerant, we frequently have problems with learning strategies. How do we learn independently? How do we get ourselves ready to learn? How do we prepare to read? And there's also a lack of motivation, and that occurs because when we're not successful at something, we choose that we don't really want to do that. And when students are not successful reading, they avoid it as much as possible. So when we look at the behaviors of skilled readers, we see that they have effective behaviors before, during, and after. And that's really one of the takeaways that I want you to have from this video, is that we want to teach what are the behaviors that skilled readers do before, what do they do during reading, and what do they do after. One of the things that they do is they're always connecting things to prior knowledge. So they're reading and they're figuring out beforehand what they're going to read about, and then while they're reading, they're putting that together. And then they're using strategies to help themselves stay focused, help themselves know when they're not paying attention, when they need to read slower, when they need to stop and think about that. So they use a lot of what we call meta-comprehension. And what we know about effective and skilled readers is they like to read. They find it to be very motivating. They find that to be not only an avenue for gaining information, but also an avenue for pleasure. So they have what we call linguistic knowledge and processing ability. They have cognitive ability, and they have metacognitive strategic competence. So they have the language, they have the ability to make meaning for what they're reading, and they have the ability to monitor their own thinking about what they're reading. So when we think about linguistic knowledge, we're talking about that automatic and rapid word recognition. And I spoke about this previously in fluency, that they can parse out phrases, they look at words, they can read sentences and know what and make sense of it. A lot of that is based on having a good vocabulary. If you don't have good vocabulary, you don't necessarily understand the concepts that are tied to that story or text. Cognitive abilities, as I said, they use prior knowledge. They have a variety of different strategies, and they know how to use those strategies. When we talk about metacomprehension, we're really talking about thinking about thinking. Am I paying attention? Am I reading at the right pace? Do I understand what these words mean? What changes do I need to make sure that I understand this? I have a little diagram here that talks about the reading process and it brings it down into before reading, during reading, and after reading. And that's really the schematic that we're going to use for this entire presentation. So what do skilled readers do before reading? Well, the first thing they do is they activate prior knowledge. They think about the topic. They anticipate what they're reading and where this is going to go. They understand the tasks. The task of reading for pleasure is very different for reading for gaining knowledge, which is very different for when you're trying to apply it. They're self-motivated. As I said earlier, skilled readers, they like to read. They want to gain information. They want to increase their knowledge. And one of the things that they do is they give themselves positive statements about themselves being good readers. I like to read, and I feel good about being a good reader. And they use appropriate strategies to stay on task. They don't let their mind wander. When their mind is wandering, they stop, they slow down, and maybe what they just say is, I need to stand up, I need to take a break for a little while, or I need to read just one more paragraph, or I need to just stop right now. What are some things that you can do as an educator to help students before reading? Well, the first is to tell them why this is an important task. Rather than just say, read this story, can we tie this to what they're doing in life now, what they're doing in the future, or can we help them ask the question why this is important and make some meaningfulness out of it? We also know that there's a lot of value in activating background knowledge, and sometimes we can just do that by showing a short little YouTube video or showing some pictures on the topic, but just getting them so that they get a sense of what the topic is and so that they can get the schema about that. We can do something called a picture walk, where we walk through the chapter or we walk through the story and we look at the pictures. That way we activate the brain and we say, oh, so this is what it's going to be. And we're making things fertile so that we're ready to learn. Sometimes we have to teach some of those essential vocabulary words so that people know what we're reading about and what are these words when we come upon them. And then we might want to ask prediction questions, get their brains working, so we kind of say, so what do you think is going to happen to the character? Or why do you think this war broke out? Or why do you think that archaeology is important? So we get them to start thinking about what they're going to read. And we can do this by introducing a graphic organizer. Maybe we'll just introduce the whole concept, the whole picture ahead of time. So those are some things we can do before reading. Then, what do skilled readers do during reading? Well, the most important is they are focused. And I know for myself, I need to sometimes know how long I'm going to read and how much time do I have, so then I can stay focused, that I know that I'm going to read for the next 10 minutes or the next 15 minutes or whatever. And so staying focused is an important part. We know that they monitor their comprehension. They know when they're off track and they try and do something about it. They anticipate and they predict. See, our minds are very active, and it's almost a natural process to start to think about, well, I wonder if the character's going to do this. I wonder when in mysteries who the killer is. How has the author not allowed me to know this at this point in the story? And they use fix-up strategies. When they're confused, they know how to go back. They know how to look up words. They know how to stop and to think about it. And they use context to help them understand it. So what can you do during reading? Well, first thing you can do is always clarify vocabulary that they struggle with. Just tell them real quickly. You can ask literal questions, so you make sure that they're focused and they know how to answer these literal questions about who, what, when, where. As I've pointed out before, I'm a very big fan of graphic organizers. I think that really helps show people how information ties together. So if we do that during this story, they can see where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. And then what we also want to do is to teach metacognitive skills, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. And then what do skilled readers do after they've read? Well, the first thing they do is they stop and reflect. They think about what they've read, and the best thing that we can ask readers to do, and skilled readers do this all the time as a natural process, is they summarize. They put it into their own words, as if they're telling the story, as if they went to a movie and they're telling their friend about the movie. Or if they went out and had a social event and they come home and they tell their friend about the social event. Well, that's what readers do too. Motivated readers also seek more information on a topic. And they also have this internal dialogue about themselves that I'm a good reader and I read this well because of my skills and my motivation. So what can you do after reading? Well, we can go and link pre-reading questions to what we see at the end of the story or end of the expository. We can teach how to summarize and how to identify the main ideas. This is a very important study skill, summarizing, but it's one that is infrequently taught to students. We think that students are going to learn this on their own, but as I've said previously, many students have learning strategies inefficiencies, and they need to be when they need it to be explained to them. How do we summarize? What are the steps? And there's some very good literature on teaching students to summarize. There's also the whole part about inferential skills, things that are not right there in the book, but you as a skilled reader have filled in, such as where it occurred, when it occurred. And so we have to help students put pieces that are not right there in the text and bring that knowledge so that helps them elaborate and understand. We want to use story maps as much as we can. We know that narrative stories has a structure. We know that expositories has a structure. We know that electronic media has a structure. We want to teach those structures and help students use those when they start and also at the end. Okay, what I would like to do is to teach you one quick reading strategy that has some efficacy. And this strategy is called the TWA strategy, the thinking before reading, the thinking while reading, and the thinking after reading. So the think before reading is we're going to teach these students the exact steps. What's the author's purpose? What do you know about this topic? What do you want to learn? So that we're really getting them ready. Then the W, while reading, is think about your reading speed. Are you reading fast enough? Are you reading slow enough? If it's dense content, we want to slow down. We're trying to link knowledge. Can you think about how this ties to this, ties to this? Sometimes all of us have to reread, and it happens as a result of for multiple reasons. Sometimes we lose focus, so then we have to catch ourselves in losing that focus and say, I lost track about 2 sentences ago. Sometimes we're not familiar with the content as familiar as we want to be, so we have to think a little bit more deeply about it and try and do that linking. And then after reading, we want to help them identify, we want to teach about the main idea. We want to teach about summarizing, and we want to focus on what you learned. So when we teach strategies, we usually follow a multiple step process. The first is the introduction. We explain why we use this strategy and how we use this strategy. We want to tell students what goes in our heads as skilled readers, because it's not obvious to folks what goes on inside of us. So we introduce why this is an important skill. Then we model that skill. We show them what we're doing. Then we provide guided practice where we do this together. So that I show you, we talk a little bit about it, we do guided practice, then we do independent practice and we have students do this on their own, and then we try and generalize it to other settings so that it's happening not only when we're working with them, but when they're doing work in school and when they're reading on their own at home. So skilled readers have automatized certain behaviors. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that our students are aware of what those skills are so that they can acquire them. So in summary, I want to emphasize that reading is a very complex process, and we have to do everything we can to help students develop those skills, because reading is important for pleasure, reading is important for learning, and nowadays it's really important to be able to read in order to do your job. It's expected that you're going to continue learning and that you're going to be able to do things independently. Unfortunately, too many students who are deaf and hard of hearing leave school without those skills. And so we got to do our part to help them develop those skills. And what we want to do is we really want to focus on those behaviors that occur before reading. We want to focus on those skills during reading, and we want to focus those skills on after reading. And we can do that through learning instruction and that teaching strategies. And those strategies that we teach usually include an introduction, modeling, guided practice, independent practice, and then generalization. So what I'd like to recommend is that you make sure that you look on the next video, which is on cognitive strategy instruction. And on this, I go into a little bit more depth about those ways of teaching learning strategies. Thank you very much.